started. Yeah, it is recording now.
Great, and you can see my slides okay, yeah? Great, fantastic. So hi everyone, my name is Carla Pericinoto, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a professor of medicine at UC San Francisco. I'm a geriatrician, palliative medicine physician, and internal medicine physician. I've been interested in the topic of loneliness and isolation for over a decade, and first started thinking about how does loneliness and isolation affect our health, and then started pivoting to think about, well, what can we actually do about this, and how can we work with organizations doing amazing work in our own communities to learn what actually works. So I'm going to talk through a brief agenda so you know what we're looking at this morning, and then we're going to start with a poll. So there we go. Okay, so I'll give a brief little welcome and introduction to what are we talking about this morning. I'm then going to turn it over to Katie Wade and Katrina Huff, who will talk to us a little bit more about the real details of how do you move from anecdotal evidence that you have in your programs to qualitative data. And then we'll pivot from there to highlight the Curry Senior Center and Daniel Hill. And it'll be a kind of a fireside chat to really talk about the real logistics of how do you do this work? How do you partner to get some evaluation done on your programs? And then we'll open up for questions and closing at the end. So before I move into some more details, Katrina, I believe we have a poll for participants before we get started. Okay, so hopefully it popped up on your screen, and we would love to know before we get started, how confident do you feel in your ability to collect qualitative data? Okay, great, fantastic. So kind of some mixed answers here. We have 81 of you participating so far. So a few of you are not confident at all, but it looks like some of you are actually feeling pretty confident in your ability to collect qualitative data, which is awesome. So maybe we'll be able to learn from you all today. And I hope the question and answer session at the end is an opportunity for us to really share best practices and what has worked with other folks. So, all right. Did we already share the results? Did we see them? Great. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So what are we talking about today? So why does data matter, and why did we, as part of the Northern California Coalition for Social Connection, want to talk about data in community-based organizations? So as some of you may be aware, the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering published a report in 2020 that said, what should healthcare systems be doing about the high prevalence of loneliness and isolation in older adults? And there were 5 main things that were a conclusion from this report. But the things that are important to highlight here, which is important for the purposes of this discussion today, is that we need to develop a more robust evidence base, and we need to strengthen ties between healthcare systems and community-based networks and resources. What does this mean? The data and the evidence for how loneliness and isolation affect our health is already very broad and there. But what is missing is knowing, now that we know that this is a problem, what can we do about this? So how do we develop that evidence base? So I know that many of you are working for organizations that focus on older adults, and many of you work on social connections, but are you able to show that your programs are doing the great work, and do you have that evidence? And how do we do that? So in the last 3 months, our group, together with the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness nationally, surveyed some of you on this call and others. We sent a survey out and we received 70 responses back from community organizations. The majority were nonprofit. And what was really neat about this survey is that we found that many of you, or many community organizations, are addressing social isolation and loneliness, but some actually had different initial goals and then pivoted to focus on social isolation because of the increased awareness on the health effects of this topic. So this is something that many of you are doing, that you were already starting to do, or you pivoted to start targeting this as part of your programs. Why is this important? And what do we do about this? So What we know is that many of you are focusing on social isolation and loneliness, but you may not be able to show that your programs are working. So we asked you, what do you think, in your opinion, is the most important thing to show that your programs have benefit? And from this survey, what we found out is that more than 77% of you thought that quotes and testimonials were the most important thing to show evidence. And so what we're going to do today is really talk about, well, how do you turn these quotes and testimonials and what we would call anecdotal evidence into something that's truly more structured qualitative evidence that you can use to provide information to your funders, to provide to payers, to provide to other people to say, hey, our programs are actually working. The other thing that you all said is that having pre and post surveys in your programs are an important tool to show that your programs work, and then satisfaction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what do we mean by quantitative and qualitative data? So this may be known to some of you, but I wanted to just highlight very briefly, what does this mean? So as a general rule, quantitative research or quantitative data is really looking for a precise measurement or a number. The variables or the numbers we're looking at are very clearly defined, and we know these in advance of doing an evaluation or research. Qualitative, in contrast, is really a little bit more subjective, but you're trying to get more of an in-depth understanding and description of what's going on. And what happens in qualitative research is that the researcher or the evaluator or the program director may not really know all the factors and the variables that are involved. And it's really through that qualitative exploration that you end up learning what's important. So this is the difference in methodologies here. To go a little bit more in detail, quantitative data is, again, very measurable. So it's a discrete number. It can be related to the numbers, then it's something related to numbers, how many. So many of you to your funders have to say, for example, this is the number of adults we served this year. This is the number of times they came to our program. So it's very concrete. There's more details here. I wanted to just throw some terms up here, which may be familiar to you or not. So the ideas of continuous variables, where it's a value within a certain range, but it's not an exact number. That might be height and weight. And then discrete is, again, the very discrete number of visits, for example. So that's quantitative data. When we look at qualitative, again, something that's important to think about here is that it's not always guided by these universal rules. It's a very fluid process, which can be make it really fun. And also very complex at the same time. There is this part that's subjective, but I want to make sure that we understand that just because it's subjective does not mean that it's not valid, and it does not mean that it's not structured. There's still a very structured component of qualitative evaluation and qualitative data collection. There's still a methodology, and it's often grounded in theory. It's something that's called grounded theory, where really what you're doing is taking a slew of observations of subjective information and trying to gather information from that and create a theory. It allows us to really get a more in-depth understanding of what we're observing, and it's getting at what's not captured in our quantitative data. And what I hear from many of the organizations I work with is like, great, numbers are one thing, but it's not really telling us the story. So it allows us to really explore those nuances. To get a little bit more specific into this, what I love about qualitative data is it helps us to really find patterns that we may not ordinarily have seen without doing this exploration. When we see patterns, it also helps us to say, are there any deviations from these patterns? And what could be explaining the people that aren't responding typically? So if you have participants in your program, some of them, the majority are saying, we love this program because of X, but you have a certain number of people that are saying, actually, we don't love it because of X. What are the factors that are contributing to the people that don't like the program, for example? And then also, as we explore this, does this uncover other questions we need to answer and other things we need to collect? What's beautiful about research and evaluation is that it's for people who love understanding and always want to have more questions and learn. So it's always about, you never know, you don't know what you don't know, and you ask a question, you learn more, and then you realize there's still so much more that you don't know. And this is what makes it fun and exciting, and also at times frustrating. So that's really about qualitative data. So going back to what we talked about and what you all said was important to show evidence. So 77% of people said that quotes and testimonials are important. So that's an example of qualitative evaluation. And we'll talk more. What Katie and Katrina are going to talk about is the details of this. Pre and post surveys can be both a quantitative and a qualitative component. So it may be that, it's pretty similar to the question that we asked right now, is at the beginning of this is how confident do you feel in your understanding, your ability to do qualitative data? So that's going to give us a number, which is a quantitative result, but we could also get some qualitative information by asking some more specific handwritten answers or more commentary, which would give us the qualitative component. Satisfaction surveys tend to be quantitative, but again, they can be mixed with qualitative data if you're asking for more details. So what I'm turning it over now to Katie and Katrina is that we're going to get into the weeds a little bit about how do you turn your quotes and your testimonials into qualitative data. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Carla. That was awesome setup. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Wade. I'm the Senior Director of Creative Engagement at Front Porch. And I'm a qualitative data enthusiast, you might say. And I have with me Katrina Huff. Katrina, you want to tell us who you are?
Yes, thank you, Katie. Hi, my name is Katrina. I am a clinical research coordinator. I work very closely with Dr. Perisinoto, and my focus is primarily on qualitative research and implementation science at UCSF.
So a little bit of fun housekeeping before we dive in. You may have seen in the symposium invitation that we're doing a raffle today. So if you registered for the symposium and you're here, then you are entered into the raffle. We're raffling off a 1-hour consultation with Dr. Carla Perisinoto. That's right. So the winner gets to pick through like our most acclaimed, most brilliant mind in the field, if I might say. And Carla hasn't given me permission to speak on her behalf, but I do know she loves a consultation over happy hour. So just a tip for our winner today. So stay through till the end and we'll pull a name to win this 1-hour consultation with Carla. So today we're all about show me the data, right? We're going to talk about how to leverage the qualitative data that you have and that you can get for most impact. So Katrina, tell us a little bit about prevalence of this.
Yeah, so before we dive into kind of ways that we can collect and assess the data that we have or the data that we're looking to gather, I wanted to communicate the increasing prevalence of qualitative data. As Dr. Perisinoto mentioned, there is an element to qualitative data that is subjective, but this by no means devalidates its scientific rigor. And I would say, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, the prevalence and the kind of rigor in research for qualitative data has really kind of increased and come to its own. Many organizations think about quotes and testimonials as, presenting to their funders and ways to perhaps improve their program development, but there are also lots of ways we can use qualitative research in the literature and present it in the literature to show our findings for, our CBOs and also the impacts on social isolation and loneliness.
So our goal today is to go from that to this. So we're going to take those mundane taupe shoes and spice them up with a popping neon trim. And so now a solid taupe, I think it has its place, right? We all love a good neutral. An anecdotal evidence like the quote that you see at the top right of this slide, it's like the taupe of telling your program story. It's great. It represents a lived experience of an individual in your program. It's important to demonstrate the story of our work. And we also need to show that the program effects go beyond a single person, like we see in a quote, right? So we want to use the qualitative data that we already have to show certain trends or common themes that have come up among multiple program participants. And those can be translated into statistics in a quantitative data that goes alongside your quotes, the stories. This also what you can find in qualitative data is usually indications of where your program's doing well or where it can be improved. We can learn a lot, as Carla said, through qualitative data. And you'll notice on the slide, it's not an either quotes or statistics, right? It's a yes and. We want both the stories and the quotes, and we want statistical data alongside those. The data that you already have may also inform future questions that you ask your participants when you're ready to collect more data, and you can learn even more that way. So we're going to take a close look at the slide for just a moment. You'll see the quote at the top right. "I really love this organization. Ever since I started using the services, I have felt more in touch with my community and connected to others. It feels good to know there are other people my age who have felt similar things to me." Right? We all can, I think, resonate with some of that quote, and we hear these in our work all the time. So what we can do is, if we had a lot of quotes, right, a lot of responses to a survey, we could start looking, well, do other people also say that they feel connected to community? Do other people say that they are feeling validated hearing about from others their same age, right? So do we see trends in the data? And that's what we're going to really dive into today, is talking about how to go from quotes like that into data analysis. So where do we start? There's a quote on the side of this screen, an image of like a toddler looking at a huge mountain of steps ahead of him. And the quote's from Arthur Ashe, says, "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." And I love this. It's so true in community-based organization work, right? Many of us are nonprofit and government, and we don't have a lot of resources. But the reality is that we can start with what we have, and actually we do have some resources that can put us on the path to better data collection and analysis. And sometimes it feels like, from a community-based perspective, an organization perspective, you know, that there's a mountain of steps ahead of us. There's so much to do, so much to be done, but we can make small incremental steps towards better telling our story and better looking at the impact of our programs. So today, first, we're going to talk about using what you have, how to use the data that you've collected systematically, like in a survey, for example. So if you have that data, and most of us have a lot of that kind of data that we've collected through surveys, you can use that to tease out themes and make broader statements about the impact of your work. So we'll talk about that. Then we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to talk about whether you have that data or not. You can go a step further in creating better evaluative information about the impact of your program. So you can define a goal. You'll draft questions to ask your participants. You'll collect and analyze the data, and then share it out with others. So what I promise is that you can do this without a lot of resources. It's doable, and that's why we're going to dive into it today together. So let's start with, what do I already have? So we all have to collect data, of course, and we all have funders that we report to. There are many reasons to collect data, and it sounds like a big idea, but we do this routinely in our work, of course. So what we want to do is gather the data that you've already collected into like a theoretical pile, right? AKA a spreadsheet. You're going to gather the data that you already have and take a look at the data to determine, was it collected in a systematic way? And so systematic means it was collected at particular time points. Every participant was given the opportunity to comment. The data was collected with a purpose in mind. And you might also think about who is collecting the data. Is it structured? Has the staff had training about collecting that data? How are they capturing the data? All of these elements are sort of the scaffolding around qualitative data collection, right? So we want to look at what you have and see, was it collected in a systematic way? Did you do that annual survey and send it out to every participant and then receive those results? Everyone had a chance to respond. That's systematic. So it's awesome if participants are calling your office or telling your staff how much they love the program. I hope we're all getting that regularly, because it feels really good to know that we are impacting those individuals. Those quotes and feedbacks are also great for marketing stories, but they're too biased to pull out generalizations, right? So for collecting quotes that have come through, you know, as I get quotes all the time, and all my staff collect quotes that they just get from participants or volunteers who are really enjoying the program, and we collect those monthly in a monthly report and put them in a pile for marketing purposes, right? But what we couldn't do is go back to that pile of quotes and try to pull out generalizations or themes, because they were so biased in the collection, right? I remember when I first started working for Front Porch, I was with Well Connected, and our office was located in an elementary school. which was awesome. And I took a call early on in my job there. I took a call one day from a super user, a participant who engaged in the group conference calls every day. And she starts telling me that this program has literally saved her life. And she's so impassioned as she's telling me this. And down the hall, a music class starts up, and the music teacher starts playing this violin with such grace. And it was like this soundtrack to the participant's story about how she found life-saving belonging in Well Connected. And I had tears in my eyes. I was looking around like, am I in a movie right now? Because there's this beautiful story of redemption set to this poignant soundtrack, right? It's a lovely moment that I will never forget. But unless I can systematically collect a lot of life-saving quotes set to violin music, then I can't make a generalization, right, that the program is life-saving for other participants. However, I am considering from our next funding report that I might play like an orchestral score behind that report and see if it has a similar effect. We can move folks to tears. And if you try that out, you can let me know how it goes. So quotes, stories, comments that you've collected systematically with structure and purpose via surveys, interviews, focus groups, where everyone had a chance to comment, that is the data that we're looking at. And I would encourage you to spread that data out in front of you, or a staff member that has strong pattern recognition skills. If you have any artists or therapists on staff, then you've got some pattern recognizers already, and ask, what do I notice about these quotes? You know, that's a great way to formulate a research question to gather more data in the future. And when you look at that and you say, what do I notice? You might see commonalities in the data. You might notice that there's some data that's missing. There's something you thought would be there, but it's not. You might see where you're getting half the story and there's a gap in information. All of these patterns inform our next data collection steps. And so we all know we must collect data, but how we go about collecting and reporting that data is what we're working on today. So I'm going to kick it to Katrina to talk about data themes as it relates to program development.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction to this, Katie. So Katie talked a lot about patterns and kind of once we've collected things in a systematic way, or if we've already done so, what kind of happens next. And so these are some quotes that we've accumulated from an actual survey. It was distributed to a large cohort. And so all of these participants were given the opportunity to respond and answer certain questions. So in this case, we want to be thinking about patterns and themes, which will eventually become what we call in qualitative research codes. So what I'd like everyone to do is we're going to go ahead and read through some of these quotes together. And as we're doing that, I just want people to be thinking about, are there any common patterns or themes coming up across these quotes that might be able to turn into kind of a generalizable piece of data, kind of like on that slide that we saw with the flats and how we moved a quote into saying a generalizable statement about what multiple people are saying. So just to read off a few of these from the slide, there's a trivia program on Wednesday mornings from 8 to 9. That's a little early for seniors. Facilitators need to stop people from talking so much so everyone has equal time. My main problem is scheduling. Ask all facilitators to maintain an equal opportunity to speak by not allowing a participant to dominate the conversation and use up more time than others. And as I'm saying these, if there's a theme or a pattern that you might be feeling is coming up, please feel free to enter it into the chat, and Katie and myself are going to be monitoring it and kind of seeing what's coming up. The art programs where they consistently cut out very often, static, and it's hard to connect. There are a couple groups that I wish would last longer. And then this individual has a suggestion: make all the programs Zoom calls. It's too weird meeting a group of people auditorily only without faces, too overwhelming and off-putting. I stopped participating when I encountered this. I need humanity. Meeting a group of strangers blind doesn't work for me. So I'm just going to take a look at the chat, and then Katie, feel free to chime in if you're seeing something come up for you as well. So scheduling as an obstacle is a great one that we can see is coming up maybe a couple times throughout these. There are some barriers to participation, whether that be technical or otherwise.
Yeah, Laura notes wanting to be heard as a theme and maybe a barrier to that. Yeah. Great. Facilitation practices, Jessica. Yes, that is a theme. Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah. Reading through Michelle's comment, listening to participants, wanting to be heard again. Definitely. Any other themes folks see?
Great. I think many of you touched upon some of the ones that we had kind of picked up as we were coding through this survey. So we definitely see scheduling and the desire to participate and the desire to be heard, and kind of that moving on to, if we look at the last quote, that in relationship to kind of social connection and feedback. And so Katie had talked a lot about, the reasons we might collect qualitative data and how you might use it for a marketing standpoint. And she's going to talk about that a little bit now.
Yeah, and just to point out what Katrina's showing here, this really helps with program development, right? This is kind of analysis that would look at, are we getting a lot of feedback specifically around facilitation? Do we need to address that in some way, right? Maybe work with facilitators. Is scheduling consistently a problem? Should we look at the scheduling, right? So this is one way that really, I think from a CBO perspective, you show folks you're hearing them, you're listening to them, you take their comments seriously by then, reflecting that back out in the program. So I love thinking about this, Katrina's analysis towards program development. And next we're gonna think about, Katrina also gonna show us the qualitative research is an iterative process. And then later we're gonna dive more into more coding examples.
Yes, definitely. So up until this point, we've kind of been thinking about what do we already have, where can we start kind of with the data that perhaps we've already collected, and how to evaluate if that data was collected in a systematic way. So we're kind of in that upper left-hand corner square, we're evaluating our existing data. And once we have done so, we can kind of move on into the wider scale qualitative research methods. So of course, once you've evaluated your existing data, we're hoping that that's kind of inspired new questions, new research projects that you might want to pursue in the future. If something came up very consistently in some of your quotes and testimonials, do you want to focus that the next time you give out a survey, or do you want to interview participants particularly about what has come up there? And so that's kind of where you would formulate a goal. And then as you move through the process and you start kind of collecting and analyzing, I just wanted to communicate that qualitative research is generally and usually a very iterative process. And so what this means is, as you are designing your surveys or your collections methods, there's probably going to be a lot of back and forth. You may start collecting your surveys and your interviews and realize there's something that's coming up very consistently, and you want to add it to the interview guide, or you want to add it to your survey to ask a more focused question on that. You may find that there's a question you've already put in and it's not worded as well as you wanted, or it's confusing the participants and you want to make sure it's more clear. And so this will mean that as you are analyzing your data, as you're collecting your data, you're going to be going back and forth so that you can kind of collect the best data possible and moving forward in the way that you want to.
Love an iterative process. I want to put kind of a point, Sohan, for Q&A. Pauline is mentioning that researchers embedding themselves in the qualitative analysis process yields rich results. And I think that's an interesting point for us to discuss in Q&A. Thank you for sharing that, Pauline. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about how you find a goal, right, Katrina? How do we, and Adam is talking about this in chat right now, what are we trying to measure? What are we looking at whenever we set about doing qualitative collection?
Definitely. So there's a variety of things that you will probably want to think about when you start constructing your next project and you're thinking about what's the next question or purpose that I'm trying to discover or work through in my next research project. And so from the survey that Dr. Perisinoto mentioned kind of in her talk at the beginning, we found that a lot of people, when they were collecting their data, were doing it for the purpose of funding reports or to give the information to their funders. So of course you want to consider your stakeholders, you want to consider your clients, you want to consider your funders, your payers, etc. And so you want to consider them, but that's going to be a little bit different than finding your purpose. So when we think about the purpose, when we're diving into constructing questions, we want to be thinking about what is our goal? What are we trying to learn from collecting this data? So a lot that could be focused on program development. We could be trying to see the demographics of the people that the organization is reaching. We might want to learn more about social isolation and loneliness and social connection and how our organization is impacting that. And so those are really the purposes. And so while it's important to consider your stakeholders and consider funders, you also want to recognize that that is not going to be the purpose of collection. You are going to be collecting it to find or to discover more about a certain probably aspect of your organization, and you will hopefully be able to present that for your funders, but it's not exactly going to be what the purpose is equal to funders, if that makes sense. You also want to be thinking about a gap in the knowledge, and this could be a couple of different things. It could be a gap that you found in your own previous collection, in your own previous research when you've assessed what you had, or it could be a gap in the overall knowledge. So maybe in the overall literature about CBOs or about your particular demographic or your particular program set. And finding a goal is really important because you want to have an overarching question that is going to drive the questions you ask your survey. So you can always return back to it if you get stuck.
Yeah, this is great. I want to note that, we started by thinking about the data that you already have and what you can do to analyze that data and share it out. And now we're moving into gathering more, more systematically gathering data, qualitative data. So starting with finding a goal, and then moving into data collection. So there are more extensive processes around qualitative research, of course, and there are much more that you can do when you feel comfortable or you have more bandwidth in your org. And Katrina's a great resource for everyone when you're identifying the questions that you want to ask folks through interviews or surveys or focus groups. She can help you shape some of that and has some great resources for that because there's a lot of detail on that piece. So what we want to think about when we're collecting data is that it's systematic, which I know you've already heard me talk about so much. You know what that means. We want to think about open-ended questions to gather the richest information that are around the main goal, the purpose that Katrina just mentioned, right? And again, she can give us resources for developing some of those questions and ensuring we're asking the questions that get back to the purpose and goal of our collection. We also want to think about delivery mechanism. So surveys are best for concise answers to specific questions. Focus groups are great for sharing and comparing in a more in-depth way. And one-on-one you might use for sensitive topics, things that can be confidential or private in nature. And again, it's going to give you that deep, rich data collection and one-on-one as well. And so you might think about, for the purpose that I've identified, the goal that we found for our data collection, what is the best delivery mechanism to get us to the place we want to be? And it might be all of these, right? It's often the case that we have many ways that we're collecting data, and they're each giving us a different facet of response of great, rich, qualitative information to work from. So you'll choose what's best for you based on your goal and of course the resources that you have at hand, right? And I know this is a lot about like, what do we have built in operationally in our organization to be able to collect data? Sometimes that's an annual survey, right? I mean, usually it is, but are there other ways that we can build in deeper data collection like focus groups or interviews, one-on-one interviews? So when we think about that, and you know what, oh, another quick note, Katrina told me, I learned from Katrina that, in surveys, the recommended amount of open-ended questions is 3, right? So you're balancing a mixed method. You have some quantitative questions that are going to give you a numerical piece of data, and you're also having open-ended questions up to 3 that are going to give you that qualitative piece that you can analyze. On this slide, you'll see on the right here, collections of butterflies, collections of stamps, right? And they're all different. Each of the butterflies is different. Each of the stamps is different from the other, but you can easily look at this and see patterns of color and shape, right? And more. You could go on about the patterns that you might see here in these collections. And that's just what data collection is, right? You're collecting a lot of disparate pieces of information, and then you're looking for how are these the same or different, right? So we're going to talk about that analysis, the how are these the same or different, that pattern finding. And these are just some tips to get started analyzing your data. And we're going to spend most of our time on analyzing data, right? Because that is the area that we all can start utilizing immediately. And of course, like all research, qualitative analysis, it can be an extensive and lengthy process, right? There is a lot of structure to it. And if you want to learn more, we'll have an additional resources slide at the end of our slides that we'll be sending out to everyone. With that said, there's a lot you can do even with limited resources, like limited staff time, for example. So what you want to do when you're looking at your data is start by finding key themes. So Katrina just had us look at a lot of quotes that were submitted via survey, and everyone in the chat identified key themes, right? Oh, I see scheduling, facilitation. What you did there was start coding data, one of the first steps to coding. So themes are often called codes in qualitative data analysis. It's a word or short phrase that represents an attribute or quality that you see in the narrative data that you have, right? So the way we looked at all of those long quotes and then distilled it down to scheduling, barriers to participation, facilitation, right? You all just naturally got that information down to a code or a theme. So you see some examples here of what codes might come up in data: feeling more confident, feeling being seen or heard, maybe confusion. You can find a lot of different short themes in the data. So what you want to do when you're looking at your whole theoretical pile of data on the spreadsheet, and we'll talk really more deeply about that, is to create a list of themes that are coming up most frequently. So you're looking at all of the pieces of stories, quotes, qualitative information that you have, and you're creating 5 to 20 themes that are consistent throughout the data. And you're looking and seeing, does this fit in any of my themes, right? And there may be some outliers that don't fit, but your goal is to try to see how many you can fit into those codes and themes. This usually comes both from an individual reviewer, like myself or Katrina might look at data and start by defining what we think the codes are in the data. But you'll definitely want to do this in your team setting, have another coworker look at your themes and how you coded the data. This is data validation. It's showing that, of the one researcher's idea of what those themes might have been, what those codes are, is that accurate? Does a second researcher or a second assistant look at that and say, yeah, I also see those codes, or actually, I'm interpreting it in a little bit of a different way. So it's good to have those conversations to validate that the codes that you've chosen are accurately representing the data that you see. So we're going to talk, Katrina's going to take us through a coding example, so the one we just saw in more in depth, and then I'm going to take us through how to use spreadsheet to do some coding.
Yeah, so this is the same example that we had kind of gone over earlier, where some of you mentioned in the chat some of the common themes that were coming up, and we can see that based on my coding and the collaborative process, a lot of those themes did come up as we were coding for us as well. So of course we have scheduling, we have some feedback for facilitators that could be helpful for group guidance. Similarly, people wanting time to share or time to be heard. Less prevalent, but still there's the duration of the program. There's some technical suggestions, which I'm sure we all have received throughout the pandemic. And then I desire social connection, which is a little bit more granular. It's a kind of more of a statement theme. And as you can see, probably from the color coding, and also I put the codes in parentheses, is that it's quite common that when you start coding, you will find that quotes will fit into more than one of your themes, especially if you're collecting, more longer and in-depth interviews or longer and in-depth responses. There's, a greater chance that an individual will touch on multiple things and will overlap with codes, and that's completely okay. And then, of course, as Katie mentioned prior, you want to kind of stick to a list between 5 and 20, and this will vary depending on how large your data set is. but you kind of want to, the more codes you have, the more kind of, or the less kind of broad sweeping statements you'll be able to make. So if you can kind of narrow down those codes to get them to be more generalized, that will be helpful in the overall coding and analysis. And then finally at the presentation process as well. So I've done it color coded here to kind of show how things are coming up over time or over and over again. And of course, there will be different ways to code through an Excel sheet like Katie will show. And then I know that some of you in the chat have mentioned specific softwares that are used for qualitative coding. And we don't touch upon that now, but that is definitely kind of something that people use, especially for larger data sets like transcripts, and can be helpful if you are hoping to kind of go into more in-depth, really rigorous qualitative analysis.
Thank you, Katrina. I love a color code. Oh, let's go back. Let's see. I'm missing my spreadsheet. Let me just bring it up for show everyone. So it's actually quite easy to get started, even if you have several quotes. And I think there are maybe over 60 quotes. This was an example from Well Connected, where they talked about which groups are you enjoying most on Well Connected, and then asked, why do you like the groups that you noted above? And what's really interesting about the data here is that there are themes that are really useful for marketing the program, because you see why people are most enjoying the program. And there are themes that are useful for recruitment of new participants in the program. So what I did was I go through, like, looking at, align the quotes up on the left side, and at the top I write leave spaces and columns for potential coding. So these start out blank, these columns. And then what I'm gathering is, if I start coding each of these, the totals are adding up in that column. So we can see which of the codes has the most, total underneath it. And then measuring that against the total number of responses I have will give me a percentage, right? So you'll notice someone here says, I like the groups. They make you think, an opportunity to be heard. They're very stimulating. So that started helping me get my first coding, right? We had intellectual stimulation to start with. Also being heard was a theme that came up in this quote. And so then I go through each quote and say, oh, informative. So we have this intellectual stimulation, information, learning kind of bucket, and enjoyable. Enjoyable was the first time enjoyable was mentioned. And so I start seeing, going through, can I bucket others into these codes? Are there different codes we might look at? And we have several here that you can see. And so you can kind of see that some are easier to code than others. For instance, someone responded, I always enjoyed working with seniors and feeling connected, useful in the community. So maybe this was a volunteer, a facilitator that filled out the participant survey. Maybe they have both roles, right? But they're really responding on around a sense of purpose. So I coded that, a sense of purpose. And then at the end, after coding, many of these, could see that only 2 people had really talked about that. And in fact, the other quote also seemed like it was probably a volunteer that was leading groups, right? And then there was only one person that had mentioned good facilitation. So I highlighted these to show you that these codes aren't strong enough, right? They didn't have strong enough representation for me to make a generalization about them. But there were some that certainly did have a strong enough representation, like intellectual stimulation or learning, right? So this concept of lifelong learning had a strong representation. Enjoyable, it's fun. Connection, social connection. I like the topics. Many people specifically said they were interested in the topic that was, listed for that group, right? And so this is really useful information. We're thinking about how to share about the program, right? How we might even inform program development. As Katrina said, we know that people are looking more for lifelong learning, so we could lean into that, and where we might recruit people into the program, right? So it helps us tell the story really well to know these specific points that people are finding enjoyable about the program. So I will go through and, it's a little bit intensive, but I love it so much. I get into the flow. I know Katrina does too, of reading each quote and then trying to see where that code might be. And so I left a few blank at the end to look at ungained group. It's very fun, right? So that would be, I would put a 1 in this column under enjoyable or fun. And then what you would see at the top is that total sum, that formula I had there, just increased, right? And that the percentage might increase as well. And so by setting up these formulas, it's really easy. By the end of the time I've coded, I have my data all lined up for me right there. And there's a lot of great, we have resources at the end of the slides, but also YouTube is a super great learning tool for how to use a spreadsheet to code data. And it's actually pretty simple once you get into it. So next we want to talk about sharing and reporting, this really critical piece of qualitative data collection and analysis. And Carla, I think, mentioned at the beginning that in our field, in the social isolation, loneliness, connection arena, we don't have a lot of data on intervention. So it's really critical that when we are collecting data and analyzing it, that we find ways to share this out. And I think for me, this has not always been a strength that I've seen in community-based organizations or in myself. And so I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. Katrina, do you want to talk a little bit about how to share out information?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of different ways to do this, as I'm sure many of you know. But the key points is you do want to be able to visualize your info and kind of present the themes that have come up or the codes that have come up, most commonly, and that you think will be really important to illustrate. So just kind of like I'm sure we were talking about before, you do want to show certain key quotes. You don't want to just limit your statistical generalizations in your report. You do want to show quotes that you feel like are communicating the impact of your organization and kind of come up most frequently. And it would also be beneficial to show this in sort of an aesthetically pleasing chart or graph if possible with your thematic codes as well. And then you want to find a way to distribute this. And as Katie just mentioned, it is really important to publish it, and if possible, in the form of a conference or symposium or even a scientific paper, because of the limited amount of research on the impact of CBOs and social isolation and loneliness. But of course, there are other more direct ways to do it as well, on your organization's website. If you don't have a website, perhaps on social media, you could share this out. If your organization has a newsletter, that would be a really important place to put it as well. And then, as I'm sure many of you are well versed in creating reports in order to share with funders.
Yeah, what I found an interesting example of this at Front Porch in a different program called Home Match, in their impact survey, which goes out to funders and other stakeholders. Ideally, we would, across all of our community-based organizations that are addressing social isolation, loneliness, connection, we'd all be using the same assessment tool, right? And when Carla mentioned the CBO, the community-based organization survey that we did, that you all responded, of the respondents, 50% are using the UCLA loneliness scale. So we were thrilled to see that, there's gaining a lot of traction. So it's going to allow us to do cross-program comparison. So I want to just say that ideally we're all moving towards using similar assessment tools, same assessment tools, so we can do those cross-program comparisons. Home Match had a scaling question, do you feel more connected to others after being in this program? Disagree to strongly agree. And so what they were able to say is 60% of respondents of their, have Home Match is a home sharing program. So they have someone with a room that shares that out with a home seeker. And they were able to say that, 60% of people felt more connected to others. And then what they did is tied that to a couple of quotes that they had collected in that survey as well. And so what you can see, this is a great example of seeing those two mixed methods side by side, right? The quotes and the quantitative piece as well. And I want to mention, based on just kind of piggybacking on what Katrina said, that Carla kind of blew my mind recently, because I was thinking, where do we put our data? How do we publish our data more effectively? We're gathering so much. How do we get that out into the world? And she mentioned, and we go to conferences all the time and present from our organization, mentioned, that conference is almost like a peer-reviewed setting, right? And then you should be able to publish that on your website so that people, that data can live on that came from that conference. And it's so simple, and it's something we can all do so easily, but it really was like, oh, that's right, that is like a peer-reviewed setting, and we do want that data to kind of live on. So just a really easy example, right, of putting your conference presentations on your website, and almost like you would with a CV. So I think we just want to say that we have other resources. Katrina has compiled some other resources here. We'll be sending this out, and there's a lot you can find online to get started. Katrina herself is a great resource, has more information about interview questions and kind of getting into the details of this. But ultimately, this is our goal. We want to go from this to that, how you go from random stories and quotes, your ingredients, to this, they may seem unconnected. And how do you turn that into delicious, compelling statistics, aka this homemade mac and cheese, right? That's our goal to do together. Anecdotal evidence, like the quote at the top of this slide, is great. It's so important to tell the story of our work and the lived experiences of our participants. But we also want to show those program effects go beyond that single person. So use the data that you have to show those trends or common themes. And let's also start on our process of gathering more data together. To hear an example of this in practice, we're going to kick it over to our panel today. So we have Ashwin and Carla and Daniel to talk to us about a collaborative partnership and evaluation.
Fantastic. Katie and Katrina, thank you so much. I think what's been really fun about this work and this coalition is that we get to learn from each other and use all of our skill sets. And with that, I would love to introduce my colleagues, Daniel and Ashwin. I'll let them each introduce themselves, but we're going to pivot a tiny bit, but talk a little bit more about an in-depth real life example of how Curry Senior Center was able to show and evaluate their program, and how a partnership with a community organization and academic center can sometimes work. Of note, spoiler alert, in that same survey that we're talking about, very few people actually thought it was important or worth it to partner with us in academics. And so hopefully we will be able to talk about how sometimes it is still a worthwhile endeavor. So Daniel, I'll let you go first if you can tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Hill, and I am the Senior Program Manager at Curry Senior Center. Curry is celebrating its 50th year of providing integrated and holistic services to older adults in the central neighborhoods of San Francisco. We have the DPH clinic and the nonprofit side, and the two work really well in providing great services to the older adult community. I've been with Curry for 7 years. I was hired to start a program to reduce isolation and loneliness. And even that was very daunting back 7 years ago. Like, how do you do that? And the intention of the program is to cultivate trusting relationships with older adults. I have a team of 6 peers. A peer is defined as an individual that has had a lived experience of navigating the behavioral health system of San Francisco. And so this team of peers cultivate trusting relationships with older adults who are either self-referred or are referred to the program as being socially isolated or lonely. And it's through this trusting relationship that when needs arise with the program participant, the peer is right there to be able to help them navigate whether they need to get a primary care provider, whether they need to see a harm reduction therapist, et cetera, and so forth. And so that's the pretty much the intention of the program. And it's been funded by the Mental Health Services Act of California, which is managed through the Department of Public Health. And we've been doing it for this month is our 7th anniversary. So
amazing. Thank you, Daniel. And Ashwin or Dr. Kotwal, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So my name is Ashwin Kotwal. I'm a geriatrician and palliative care physician at UCSF. My clinical practice is at the San Francisco VA. And I do research on loneliness and isolation among older adults in general, but particularly those with serious illness or dementia or cognitive impairment. In recent years, I've been really fortunate to partner with Carla, who's a friend, mentor, colleague, to really think through partnerships with community organizations to build the evidence base on interventions. And so I'm excited to be here and to think through how we were able to partner with Daniel and Curry Senior Center for this peer program.
Awesome. So with that, Daniel, I want to think back, and I literally cannot believe it's been 7 years. I think there's also the pandemic warp where I'm now, someone told me recently, you add 2 years. If you think it was 2 years ago, it was really 4 years ago. So I'm now trying to remember what year we're in, et cetera. But thinking back, can you remember, why you all decided to partner with us at UCSF? Like what was potentially missing from what you wanted to do, or what did you need help with, or did you not? Or tell me a little bit about how we started working together to refresh my memory and help all of us here on the call.
Certainly. So the program was an innovation program. So it had a short-term contract. Innovation programs through MHSA run 2 to 5 years. And there was no guarantee at the end of those 5 years what would happen to the program. And so about 2 years into the program, we really believed in what we were doing, and we were really seeing the impact of immediately of how lives were changing. And so we recognized that we might need to pursue other funding outside of MHSA. And so we asked ourselves, how do we do that? And then my boss, Dave Canego, the executive director, said, oh, I know this, I met this woman the other day at an interview, and da-da-da-da. Next thing you know, off we are running with Carla. Carla comes in and sits down, and we explained that we needed other funding, and Carla laid out the map and said, okay, this is how you do it.
Carla, you're muted.
I said such great things. I'm sorry you all missed it. No, I'm just kidding. So I think what I'm hearing is that, you were really focused on funding and how to maintain the funding. And part of that sometimes has to do with, can you show that what you're doing has value, and however we define value. And if I remember correctly, we wanted to figure out how can we evaluate this program and how we show. And when we first worked together, you guys had a questionnaire, you had a thing that you were trying to evaluate, and we had to do a little bit structure around it. Now, there are many people who think that, researchers are a little scary or weird, which may partially be true. I'll take the weird part, but how did we get past that, or did we? Maybe I'm still scary, but talk us through, and for other people on the call, how we kind of finessed the evaluation and what that process was like.
Sure. So prior to meeting Carla, we had worked with MHSA. They were a really great support. And we came up with an in-house isolation scale. And then we were also doing surveys. And those were pretty much our two main ways of collecting data. And it served the purpose. It served the purpose of reporting to MHSA and our stakeholders. It served the purpose of convincing us that what we were doing was certainly creating an impact. And then we sat down with Carla, and Carla explained that funders would be looking probably more at wanting to see more validated measures. So she introduced to us the Duke isolation scale and the UCLA loneliness scale. as examples. And so the process, you know, as we began discussing it more with Carla, became increasingly daunting. And I mean, I was pretty much shaking in my boots going, oh my God, how are we going to do this? Because here we were, we had a program and we're wanting to do this big change, and it felt like midstream. How do you dam up the stream? How do you stop everything in order to implement it? And it didn't really turn out to be that way at all. But all of these fears, the fears of like one thing that I was had a very strong opinion on was I never had the peers do any type of paperwork in front of the program participants. And that was just out of respect to that relationship. I think one of the wonderful things about the program is that the peers don't have an agenda necessarily, and you know, that's really kind of obvious. And the fear was that paper, you know, taking notes, you know, collecting information, you know, might have some kind of adverse effect to that relationship. So along comes Carla and company, and next thing you know, we have a huge questionnaire, you know, and I was like going, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? And how is this going to impact those relationships? So actually, I think that we had talked about doing the assessments every 3 months in the beginning. And I was like going, oh, no way, we're not going to do that. So we agreed at every 6 months. And then also some of the things that I learned was that the individual peer would not be asking this of their own program participants, somebody else from a different peer would be asking these. So therefore it wouldn't have the impact. It seemed kind of huge, you know, like there's a lot of data to collect, and looking back now, I wish we had collected more data. I was joking with my husband the other night saying, I think when I grow up, I want to become a researcher. But anyway, but then also how much time would it take was, you know, another concern. And how would it be received by program participants? Like, would it, you know, would they not want to be part of a research project? What happens if they didn't want to answer some of the questions? And then looking at the questions themselves, I mean, if anyone has ever looked at the Duke isolation scale, I mean, they're very invasive questions. I mean, like I had a very difficult time asking these of a few participants, you know, like, you know, how do you feel about your role in your family? Or, you know, do you feel heard? These sorts of questions. I mean, it carries a lot of stigma. And so these were my concerns. And but we just had to take a deep breath and put one foot in front of the other and push through. So.
And Daniel, what I'm hearing is that, you know, it wasn't just about designing a survey, it was also about kind of working together to figure out all the elements of those surveys, to understand the trade-offs of asking certain questions with others, the time, the relationships that might be affected. So it was a really kind of iterative process of kind of figuring out how to build this collaboration. And I'm wondering if you and Carla can reflect a little bit on, you know, what were some of the positive outcomes of this collaboration, and how did you know, this multiple year experience change how you think about collaborations?
Well, I still like Daniel, and I think he still likes me most of the time. But you know, if I can add here, I think that, and it also is reflecting on one of the questions in the chat that Adam brought up about what are the right questionnaires, and is the UCLA 3 really the right question? And I think what was really cool about this is that part of this is figuring out what is the right question for your population. And I think, what do you consider a positive outcome? I don't necessarily think that if you don't see a change in loneliness, that means that your intervention sucks. I think it may be, are we asking the right questions or not? For some people that have some degree of loneliness, maybe not worsening is actually the right thing. I think what we realized with Curry, that loneliness actually was the right question, but the Duke was probably the wrong measurement. And that's actually incredible contribution to the field to say this may not be the right thing. And we coupled this with some qualitative data also to get at those nuances and figure out what was working and what wasn't working. And I think the other thing that was incredibly humbling for me is that Daniel and his team know his community very, very well. And what they contributed to the literature was that we, as researchers and sitting over here, knew very little about how to think about the barriers that people have to connection and what's keeping people away or what's keeping people isolated. And Daniel and his team did come up with this questionnaire and this scale, which is like, what are the numbers of barriers people have? And that was huge. And we were able to show that over this, and, you know, Ashwin, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you took this data together, but we were able to show that by having a peer companion, people had decreased barriers to socializing over the one year period. And that's amazing. And I could not have come up with that. That was purely Daniel and his team. So that's what was amazing to me. Daniel.
Yeah, and I want to just say that, you know, working with Carla, you know, through the, I guess it's been like 5.5 years now, has been really terrific. I have learned so much, and it has turned me, I guess it's really brought out the nerd in me, because I now look at the data that we're collecting, and I really want to get granular about it. Like I want to track, I want to track things that I never even thought that I would have wanted to track before. Like, for example, you know, and I also want to say that I love reading the narrative along with the data. And so, like, one thing that I would love to track, for example, is a program participant's journey through, let's say, medical provide, like how many medical visits did they used to have? You know, how much was the peers intervention contributing to fewer medical visits? Or the same thing could go for mental health or substance use therapies, just to be able to track that along the way, see that person's journey. So that, you know, I get into wanting to track things like that now, where it never even crossed my mind before meeting with Carla. But then also, I think that what the data has shown, and, you know, and I just really appreciate everybody on the UCSF team that has supported this program in this way, is to actually be able to see it's like, wow, you know, there was a 15% decrease in depression, and there, you know, over a 1 year period, and there was a 15% decrease in loneliness. And whereas before, you know, I was second guessing myself, you know, we were going off of off of like surveys where everybody was, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, you know, how do you like the program? And they're all circling 5s. Well, it doesn't really tell you anything. And so now I was really able to see on a much finer level through learning from the UCSF team, you know, what stands out, you know, as far as measuring significant impact. So I appreciate that so much about the collaboration.
If I can, I'm going to ask you, Ashwin, again, like, you're a researcher, and you've, for many years, I mean, you're trained as an anthropologist, and so you're familiar with qualitative data, but you also do a lot of secondary data, but then you started working with Curry. So I'd love to know about, like, how you took all this information and turned it into this publication. And also, just for full disclosure, this is not a plug for everyone to work with UCSF, just to be clear. This, I mean, although I'd love to, this is really about how we can think about these collaborations and how it can become less scary to do some of this work recognize what you're good at and recognize when you need a partner, because I can't do this all alone. Some of you can do it alone, but that's not my skill set. And so it's how can we do this in group? So Ashwin.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and I think part of what draws me to this field is that it requires a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration and kind of different approaches to addressing this complex problem. So when I think about my own research background, I started off in technology, then I actually moved to kind of big data work, working with the National Opinion Research Center and designing surveys and thinking it really carefully about data collection. I did my master's in biostatistics. And then, as I've kind of gone through my research career, I have really focused on secondary data analysis, meaning I use really large data sets to develop the evidence base for describing epidemiologic data as to why certain issues may be, cause health impacts. So for example, we described the prevalence of loneliness and social isolation at the end of life among seriously ill older adults. We've just looked at the relationship of loneliness and isolation with healthcare use among high-risk groups. And so I think, what I've learned is that we need that data can be really helpful in defining the problem. And it can help to inform some of the strategies by which we can actually address these issues. When we figure out that there are risk factors for loneliness and isolation, by gender or by socioeconomic status, then we can design programs to really address this and see if we can make an impact there. And so that's what I've been really excited about over these last couple of years, is translating some of that those research findings that we take from these large data sets to community organizations that are really trying to make a difference in changing those outcomes. I'm also finding that, when we are able to have these collaborations, we can present these findings in ways that are interpretable by the healthcare field. So not just funders, but also health systems, which are used to seeing data and presented in a particular way. And what we really need, as Carla mentioned earlier from the National Academy of Sciences report, what we really need is these partnerships between community organizations and health systems to really effectively build out these programs and see, measure the impact. So I think by moving in this direction that I've done from kind of these large data sets to the intervention work, I feel like we've been able to push some of this conversation forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashwin. I'm going to ask if Daniel or Ashwin, if either of you have some, parting thoughts, and if not, please do say anything. And if not, I think we're going to move to the question and answer time and go from there. So any parting thoughts?
Well, I would just say that, change is hard. And I mean, if you're considering partnering and increasing data, the use of data, I mean, just take a deep breath and go and give yourself a lot of grace. And I think that that's what ultimately worked at Curry, was just going slowly, just putting one foot in front of the other and not being intimidated by it, and just taking care of yourself along the way.
That's awesome. I was going to add that I forgot that at some point, Daniel, I met with you and the peers and shared some of our preliminary findings. And I think the other part of this that we don't often highlight is that the peers felt that they were doing amazing work, and they had those individual patient stories, client stories to say, X client feels this, and then to have that real life story, which is what touches our heart, and then pair that with the data. Well, this is actually what the overall, it was like this amazing thing. And it really elevated the peers to be able to say like, wow, what we're doing is amazing. We now have a published article. Daniel and I think are presenting in DC later this June. And so like, that's awesome. And, you know, when Ashwin published the paper also, you know, one of the most well-known people in palliative care tweeted on this article and was like, this is where we should be spending our healthcare dollars. And so this is one example of an amazing organization doing amazing work. I know there's more of you doing that. And so how can we get the word out and show what you're doing in a way that really, like, you know what you're doing, but let's really, really try to show it. So.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on both of those comments and saying, you know, there is amazing work being done by you all, and we're trying to translate that into this kind of actionable evidence so that we can share this with health systems, both locally and nationally. Part of our goal as researchers is not only to evaluate the evidence for particular interventions, but also to share that, to disseminate it nationally or even internationally, to show how other communities might develop these types of programs to address the needs that they're seeing. And so, you know, because we were able to publish this article, you know, we've gotten a lot of feedback from other communities around the country asking, you know, how can we implement this type of program? You know, I saw that this peer intervention has become, you know, highly cited amongst a number of other journals who are trying to develop similar peer programs. Even, you know, just saw one article from Amsterdam. So I mean, there's a lot that's here that's really relevant to your particular program, but we're trying to build the evidence and knowledge base so that we can tackle this problem more broadly.
Great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we do have some great questions from the audience. So I'll also bring Katrina and Katie into the pen. But let's start with the question of where do we start once we have the quotes? And I think I'll ask Katrina to start us off for the question. I'll read it off. For this kind of analysis, do you start with what you are trying to measure? For example, effort or effect, quantity versus quality, or are you more open and look for patterns that fit?
That's a really good question. And I think to give you kind of probably not the answer you wanted, it's both. There are different ways to go about like qualitative research methods. And I think Katie will be able to say a lot more on this, especially for kind of the surveys that her organization has collected. But that's kind of, you just kind of hit the nail on the head. There are two ways to go about it. There are occasionally people will go into the data set that they have with a list of codes based off of the actual purpose of the collection. So for example, if the purpose was to learn more about social isolation and loneliness, or it was to learn more about kind of the anxiety of your cohort, perhaps you go in with a code book that's like looking for quotes about anxiety, quotes about mental health, quotes about improvements, quotes about connection, and then move from there trying to find those. Another thing is you could also go in blind and you basically read all of your transcripts or all of your data set and kind of make a list and a tally of what's coming up the most. And I think like has come up multiple times is that you will find that qualitative research and research in general is iterative. So by the time you have developed a code book, chances are it'll change 2 or 3 times during your analysis process. As you go through coding, you'll find things that are more granular, and then you'll find things that are more broad. And you will likely find things that were unexpected in your data during the analysis process. So that will require you to regroup your themes usually. And hopefully by the time you're ready to kind of start sharing and report is the time you will have kind of a solidified code book. So I guess be prepared to be flexible on that end. Katie, did you have anything that you wanted to add onto that?
Well, that was beautiful. I was going to say the exact same thing. Just be prepared to be flexible. It will change however you go into it. Either one of those methods, it's going to change when you get into it. That was great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, you know, Pauline answers in the chat also is it's the answer why and going more in depth. And I love that. And I think, you know, I think the way our team has done this is that, I mean, think because we're starting from a point of why, of wanting to understand why does the Curry Peer Mentorship Program work as a broad question. I might, because it's really hard to be completely unbiased and not have some hypotheses, but I think where you can run into problems is if you're too narrow and assuming this is going to be your answer. So I may have some preconception ideas, like I think that, for example, I think that people living in the Tenderloin are isolated because of the high crime in their neighborhood. So I may anchor on that. But if I only think that is the answer, I'm going to miss the slew of other things that may be happening and that people may be experiencing. And that's where being open and letting the codes or letting the quotes guide you in terms of what comes out can be really, really fascinating. I think similarly, another thing that we learned is during the pandemic with some other work that we've done, I was really assuming that all of our older adults were going to say technology sucks. It turns out that like I needed to remove my preconception ideas and learn that actually the experience is quite varied. And you have to let people speak for themselves and actually learn that that's not necessarily true. And so then we get into the why and who are the people where it doesn't suck for, excuse my unelegant language, and which is more PG than usual. And so that's kind of how we think about this.
Yeah. Go
sorry.
ahead, Ashwin.
I was just going to add two things. The first is often as you're doing analysis, you may also be collecting data at the same time. So it's what we call concurrent analysis. And sometimes that can be helpful. You're kind of discovering new things and that might be informing your subsequent interviews and your interview guide, how you might explore kind of unexpected findings. The second thing is often a lot of qualitative work will do something called member checking, which is, you develop these codes and themes and you feel like you have a good idea of what's going on. Then you actually go back to the people that you're interviewed or back to the communities that participated in the study and see if your findings make sense. And so that can be a really valuable thing, particularly as, for intervention development, for studies on implementation, to really make sure you're getting a well-rounded group of findings.
Thank you. I do want to circle back to Carla's point about preconceptions that we may have sometimes. And this is a question for all of you, I think. How often did you find that your gut and your preconceptions were wrong and the data took you in a direction that you weren't prepared for? Anybody can jump on. Katrina, Katie, Carla.
I think some of the time, I think it's maybe sometimes not even that it's like, I think it just opens up new avenues or new directions that I hadn't thought about. I think that when we were designing the questionnaire and evaluation tool for Curry, I actually really didn't know which tool was going to be the most helpful. I think we knew that we wanted to use validated tools to actually kind of test them out in real life. But I didn't know how difficult the Duke was going to be, for example, but I think it was important to try out. I also know that there's often a lot of hesitancy in administering some of these, but we actually found that some of them were actually okay to administer. So I think there's some humility that comes with this in terms of I forgot what I was going to say, of just being prepared for unexpected answers or for you to have to pivot in some ways, and I think just like Daniel says, like now he's a nerd and wants to answer new questions. I also think if we were to revise this, we would remove some questions. And so I think that's the iterative process of like, we started with this really long one to get a sense, and then you're like, okay, we don't need all these anymore, but we can focus on these. And so I think that's part of the part that's important in terms of were you surprised by your findings, or were you surprised by what tools you don't actually need? So.
And we can now pivot to, I think, the logistics of qualitative analysis. There were great conversations about the software, what type of software, and the role of software. And then maybe we can start with saturation. I think Ashwin was talking about it in the chat. What's the percentage of responses that are needed to confidently pull out codes or themes?
Yeah, it's a good question. This actually comes up a lot. I think, in quantitative data analysis, we're often thinking about sample size and the power to detect a difference. So those are some of the terms that may come up. Qualitative data is really different. You're approaching these questions, these research questions differently. So it really depends on the scope of the research question, the diversity of your sample. But in general, the goal for a thematic analysis is to interview enough people that you're not generating new codes or themes with additional interviews. Thematic saturation. So even if you can interview 30 people, but if after the 10th interview you're not getting new information, you achieve saturation. There are studies on how many interviews you have to do in order to achieve saturation. Some of these studies indicate you can do as few as 8 interviews. I've read published studies that have 5 interviews. There can be different levels. Some, will do up to 30 to 40 different interviews, especially if the sample is really diverse or the research question is really broad. And of course, there are different ways of gathering data, whether it's interviews, observation, or kind of analysis of kind of different data elements. So there's a lot to be said here, but I think what's most important is thinking about what the goals are with your research project and kind of analyzing as you go to see if you're achieving that type of thematic saturation and need to do additional interviews.
Just to add something to that, Ashwin, and thanks for that that explanation, is that I think, so my experience, and please all of you chime in, is that many of you are getting quotes and anecdotes from people just because they call and say, I love your program. And so how do you move from that to actually trying to be more structured about how you collect it and making sure you have a diversity in the experiences you're gathering? Because if you're only getting in detail answers from the people that say your program is amazing, well, what are we sure that that's representative of the people that you're serving? So how do you make sure that you're being as inclusive as possible to try to get that right number of people to get the saturation? So that's something else to really think through there. It is often very helpful to get the people that actually don't like what you're doing so that you can find out, well, why is that? Of course, this is what's also really tricky about research, and especially qualitative, is that often the people that love the stuff are the ones that really want to contribute, or it's the really people that hate it that really want to contribute. So what about the people in the middle? And so that can be some nuances to try to get at that.
I love one theme I'm hearing both in Ashwin and Carla, what you're saying is the data will tell you, partly the answer to this question. And I'm thinking about Katrina. We tried to code something recently, an open-ended survey question that had maybe 12 responses, and they were so disparate. We weren't able to come up with a theme from those 12, but had it been a different set of 12 responses, perhaps we could have said something, and maybe there would have been something strong in those. So, the data is going to kind of guide you in that way as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just as an example, with the peer program, for example, you might have a research question that is, how do, participants interact with peers? Super broad. You might have a really broad interview guide and be getting at many, many different elements of the peer program. Or you could have a really specific question on, how do peers facilitate interaction with the healthcare system? In that case, it might be a really focused interview guide. But either way, you'd probably have to analyze as you go to see what's happening with people's responses, and if you have to change your interview guide. One way that we often group the type of analysis that we're doing is inductive coding, where, as Katrina mentioned, you're kind of going in blind and you're kind of just seeing what is emerging here, versus deductive coding, where you already have kind of an idea of how things are working and you're trying to see and fit what you're seeing into certain categories.
I also just wanted to quickly touch upon something that Katie said that was really interesting about how we had a question with really limited responses, and we didn't feel that it was too, or we felt that it was too disparate to actually code with themes, but this actually still helped us learn something about not only our, survey method that we said like, maybe we didn't ask this question in a way that was clear enough, but then, and so maybe in the future, let's adapt it, were we to do this again. And it also helped us understand that perhaps what we were asking about in the community that we were targeting, there was a limited understanding of that topic. And so that helped us learn more about, our sample and what their knowledge was on the things that we were asking. And we thought, okay, maybe we need to define this, or maybe this is something we need to kind of communicate more when we, not just in our survey, but, in our organizations.
Yeah, and actually, that's such a great point, Katrina, because our overall thought that, oh, I don't know if the sample of folks responding to this survey quite understand, the topic at hand, was borne out in other survey questions, right? So then as we were analyzing, we were able to see we could code to sort of back up that feeling that we had when we looked at those 12 responses.
I wanted to just give an example, if I might, of a question that we asked early on. And there was an assumption that people that were isolated and lonely were they were not connected to services. So one of our goals was, to find those individuals. But after like a year of doing outreach, everybody was connected to services. And so that assumption was therefore, just because people had case managers, therapists, doctors, et cetera, and so forth, they still were lonely and isolated. They could have 5 appointments a week and they still were experiencing that. So that was an example of something that we eliminated early on out of our in-house isolation scale, and didn't carry over into the more in-depth work that we did with UCSF.
And it's sounding like when conducting qualitative data analysis, there are different tools that we can use, right? So I was hoping you all could talk a little bit about 2 specific tools that came up in the chat. One is data analysis software, so software to analyze these quotes and information coming in. And the second is the tool of ethnography and how it may add to the research.
So my software is called Post-it notes, as I told my team, like when I wrote my undergraduate thesis, I had beautiful color-coded Post-it notes. I still think they're amazing. And I think it's important to remember that analog is still really helpful. And so I often still use, I go analog, and then maybe I'll give it to Katrina to put it into a database. No, I think it's really about like, what works for you, where are you most comfortable with, how big is the sample, and to get a sense of what's going to be tool. And I'll let other people answer that. I will also say that I actually train in anthropology, and I think ethnography is such an amazing tool. And thinking back of what got me interested in research to begin with was much more of the ethnography and qualitative. So to give you an example, my undergraduate thesis was on the use of interpreters in a healthcare system. And so it was a combination of me of sitting in the clinics as an interpreter watching, also doing walks of my neighborhood to understand the different relationships that people had with their community, sitting with the orthopedic residents that I was interviewing, doing one-on-one interviews with the residents, with the non-English speakers, and then compiling all that together. I don't think I would have had the same experience had I just done questionnaires and not had that ethnographic component. So there's different ways to doing this. So thanks for bringing up that question. And I'm glad that other people like Post-its too. Go Post-its.
Yeah, to touch. Oh, okay.
No, I was going to say someone else. Please add to non-Post-it methods.
Yeah. So Katie, you showed us a spreadsheet that she had used in one of her qualitative coding projects, and so that's kind of the first, I would say, step that I mean, you can start with Post-its if you want, maybe even like color-coded highlighters if you would like. And then we talked a little bit about Excel sheets. There are formal softwares such as There's Atlas, there's something called Deduce, there's something called In Vivo, and I think there's a handful more that I am just not aware of. That will depend on your organization's needs and your project. So just, I guess, full disclosure, these programs will usually cost a certain amount of money. And so this will depend on your resources and the need for your project. If you're working with maybe survey data, so they're shorter responses, you may decide that a spreadsheet is the best way to go. If you're working with a larger scale transcripts that go on for 10 to 20 pages, or focus groups where you're going to have multiple participants speaking, you may feel that you want to put the resources towards a software. One of the benefits of these software in conjunction with ethnography is you can code, and they will generally help you with visualizing how codes are overlapping, and you can even attach kind of maybe a demographic spreadsheet with your participants, so you can kind of see more larger scale analyses of how your themes are coinciding with, you know, certain people in this demographic group, and that is really helpful. But again, this is kind of, I'm sorry, not a helpful answer. It's more like it will depend on your resources, and it will depend on the type of project you are going about, and the research question, you know, what you're trying to learn in general. I hope that helped.
I just want to make a tiny point that in our field specifically, you know, field observation is really useful for folks living with memory loss who aren't going to be able to complete the standardized assessments, the many of the tools that we're using, although there are other tools, right? But for me, looking at the impact of our programs, field observation, you know, that observing from the background that you're describing is a piece of ethnography, is really useful data.
Yeah, and I was hoping we spend the last few minutes of the Q&A session talking about the people that are interviewing, collecting these responses. What would an ideal training session look like for that? And then we can, if there's time, hopefully also talk about the collaborative effort that exists once you have the data. You know, how do we prevent things like overcoding or undercoding? So I'll talk to you all for that.
I think in terms of training, I think there can be, it can be elegant and unelegant. And first of all, I think there are several just training courses in general about human subjects research. And again, whether it's broad or narrow, I think it's really important to just remember that this is private information, and how do you have the skill set to just make sure that you are as unbiased as possible and not ask leading questions. And so that's actually the bulk of it. Or I think one of the key pieces of it is not being leading and being open to the responses, and then having a standard process to record that information or collect that information, as Adam notes, so that you don't lose the fidelity in written and transcribing, so it's really verbatim. So that's some things to think about there as well. Other thoughts from the team?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear Daniel and Katie's thoughts on this as well. You know, having a dedicated training session where you go through the survey, think about, you know, how to create standardized protocols of administering the survey, with particular attention to sensitive or scales that might come up, and some of the discomfort, I think is really important. So when we were administering a survey at the start of the COVID pandemic, we had several sessions where we went through with people how to have a standardized protocol and deal with issues as they came up. You know, another part of this is how to enter the data in a standardized way. You know, how can you kind of move through the surveys, use certain data software. For example, at UCSF, we use REDCap. How to think about open-ended responses, or some of the kind of off-the-cuff remarks that survey respondents might have, to capture that if that's important to you. And then lastly, to think through, follow-up and some of the administrative things to keep that organized, because a large survey can get complicated very quickly. So there's a lot to think about there, but I'm curious to hear what Daniel and Katie think, and Sohan and Katrina have done just tons of surveys on our end, so I would love to hear what they think too.
So at our end, I'm just going to be honest and just say that we went through the ethics and research training provided by city programs. And then, we actually, in the beginning, we only used one person to do the questionnaires. And so I would say that that person was trained, and then I had just a lot of one-on-one conversations with that individual about asking those uncomfortable questions. I wish that we would have a training for my staff now, really, on how do you deal with the uncomfortable questions, and how do, like, we have, for example, folks from the LGBTQ community, when asked the questions about family, many have been ostracized by their families, and so they're really not relevant. We had somebody say the other day about the depression the scale that we're using is like, I'm depressed, I'm always going to be depressed. It was almost, it was kind of a harsh statement. And so how do I support my staff, in providing a thoughtful response to, people's reactions to some of these intrusive questions. So I think training is really, quite important, but I also would say that ongoing support is equally important as well. If that's all.
Yeah, I think you're also speaking to that in many staff working in programs like ours, right, that are addressing social isolation, loneliness, connection, already have a lot of the baseline skills needed to do active listening, to sit with tough emotional responses, so many people have a lot of experience doing that. And, as we're thinking about which staff or which volunteers are going to administer the survey, that is something to think about too, who has that experience and those skills already embedded, and then training on top of that. I think one interesting thing that I thought of is even just in asking demographic questions, this has come up for us in our organization, asking income, for example, asking sexual orientation. Depending on the staff member, it's been harder for some to do that than others. So we kind of discovered this because we could see that some of staff members weren't having that question filled out, a particular question, like income, for example. Other staff members were. And so we're able to say, like, what's going on here? And one of the staff members shared their technique for asking that question in a really unbiased way. Oh, here's how I get the answers. I ask it this way. And it was a really great learning experience to share in the staff, something, that was working well for one of our members. And then the third thing that came to mind was just offering proof of listening to the participants that are taking your surveys and interviews and focus groups, showing the end results back to them. Ashwin mentioned going back and saying, does this resonate with your experience, what we're finding here in the data? And sharing with them what their input, how that's going out into the world, I think is a pretty critical piece of this.
Thank you all for your thoughts. Do we have time for the question about, coding versus overcoding and other?
I think probably just maybe a brief commentary on that. I think this is tricky. I think this is one of the hard things about, we've had, for transparency, I think in our team, we've had wonderful discussions about how we code, what differences and similarities we have. I went through some of the transcripts, and I think what's really, there's no exact rule book on how to do this. We even had discussions in our team about, do we need double coding and two people reviewing? And there's a lot of variation in the literature about what should be done. And in fact, like I pulled a paper on, like, no, you don't need to do this. And I think it's really about trying to get a sense of, are you capturing the information that you're receiving from your clients as best as possible without over interpreting. I think that's what's really hard. And I think that's one of the things, what I mean by over coding, is that when you infer what people are trying to say, that's where it can get really tricky and gray. And actually later this afternoon, I think in our own internal team meeting about one of our projects, we're going to be spending a little bit of time on this. And I think the reason to talk about this is that it's not black and white, and it requires discussion in our team. So yeah.
Really, really quickly to piggyback off of what Carla said, is that usually and ideally qualitative analysis is a collaborative effort with a lot of back and forth. Like we said, it's an iterative process. But I mean, we have to be aware of our resources. I mean, I remember when I had done a project a while ago, I had a primary investigator who was like, "You're on your own. Good luck." And so that was just kind of where it was with that particular project. And so, I mean, the most you can share with a team that you think can read your transcripts and in your analysis, that would be great. To just collaborate and hear each other's thoughts, so everyone is aware, like on the same page of your codes.
Thank you all so much for your thoughts. So to wrap up the meeting, do we want to do the raffle? Do we want to do the closing statements? How do we want to go about it?
Yeah, I think I'll just give a brief closing statement, and we might give people a couple more minutes back of their day before lunchtime. But I just want to say that I'm really grateful to all of you that joined today. For those of you that don't know, we started this coalition here in Northern California with some support from the Long Foundation, for which we are very grateful. And also want to thank my colleague, Maureen Feldman, who is on the call also, who started the Southern California Coalition. And so it's just really exciting to see momentum in this space. When I started this research over a decade ago, this was a very small topic. And I think we're now realizing how much this is affecting all of us and how much we can learn from each other. And so this coalition is really meant to be something that it is for us. You know, what is helpful, what is not helpful, please give us feedback. We will do our core analysis of your feedback and take some thematic saturation to see where we're doing well and where we're not. But we'd love to make this as useful as possible to all of us. What's missing? What could we do differently? So thank you so much for being here, for being a part of this. I do this work because of amazing colleagues like you and for making the difference in the lives of our community. So with that, I will let Sohan announce the raffle results. If you don't want to meet with me, that is also fine. So we were just trying to make something interesting to keep the conversation going, but you have no obligations to meet with me if you win. Just don't make me cry about it.
We'll protect you.
Thank you.
All right, should I do a little? Our winner for today is Joanne Halliday from Marin County. Joanne, good to see you on the call. We will be following up with an email about how you can meet with Carla. And thank you so much. Thanks everyone.
Wonderful.
For your time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everyone.
Take
Thank you.
care. Thanks so much.
And Carla, just as the winner of the raffle, I will definitely be taking you up on the offer, I promise you. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. Thank you.
Oh, great. I'm so glad. I look forward to connecting. Really excited. Okay. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.